Hello, and welcome to Book 7 of St. Augustine's Confessions. As we come to sort of the middle of the book, there's going to be a lot of defining moments in this book. And I recognize this book can be a little bit hard to read. There's a lot of Augustine struggling with philosophy, theology, metaphysical questions. It can be difficult to follow him sometimes. I'll do my best to make the journey a little easier. I'm holding up the translation that we're using, although I do pull from different translations. One of the things that I want to keep returning to, you can see I'm holding the book, is this book comes out of Scripture. Everything that Augustine is telling us about comes out of his close relationship with Scripture. And I want us to remember that and keep that in mind. When we think about Augustine's relationship with Scripture, I don't think we can emphasize enough, we wouldn't have the man, this doctor of the church, without Scripture. But I thought we should make this really important distinction. And I was listening to a scholar from the Augustine Institute who made this point. I'm a huge fan of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, doctor of the church. Some consider him the last doctor in the Western church. The last for the Eastern would be St. John Damascene. But Bernard of Clairvaux, who lived during the time of the Middle Ages, when you read Bernard of Clairvaux's writings, this is a man who grew up with Scripture. And I like how this scholar said this. For Bernard, Scripture was his first language, but it was not so for Augustine. So keep in mind, all of the revelations that Augustine is having is because he's shocked to learn that the language of the Bible is what was in his heart and what he was discovering, but it's not how he was raised, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about he was raised. In fact, it's so much his second language that he speaks it with an accent. Isn't that something? I thought this would be a good question for all of us to reflect upon. I myself was not raised in the Scriptures. I became immersed in Scripture in my 20s and 30s, late 20s, and then in my 30s. And I can speak the language of Scripture, but I guess I do speak it with an accent or as a dialect. It's not my first language. But I do think it gives us all hope. Augustine's first language was rhetoric, was Plato, obviously the Manichees. So I think it'd be good to reflect on what is your first language. For me, it was French poetry. I fell in love with poetry. I come from my mother's background was in English poetry, so I grew up with poets. I would say that was more my first language, and then later Scripture came. And unfortunately, my first language was also a lot of bad television too. It's probably like reruns of the Brady Bunch. That was unfortunately one of my first languages also. So it's good to ask, what is your first language and what language are your kids learning? And Augustine, he's really struggling because Scripture was not his first language. So I thought that was something really interesting to think about. I've entitled this podcast Curiositas, which for Augustine is spiritual blindness, which we're going to talk about. We read at great length in Book 7 how Augustine's vision is clogged. He cannot see clearly. He says I'm in the very beginning of this book. He says he's talking about the gaze of his mind. By the way, that word gaze, it comes up a lot in this book. He says the gaze of my mind was on cloud of filth that hovered round me, and I hardly got rid of it. Then in another twinkling of an eye, it was back again, clotted together, invading and clogging my vision. And so there's a lot in this book about his vision and how he cannot see clearly. And in this book, we're going to see his gaze. What is he looking at? What is he seeing? And then all of a sudden, he's going to have a moment where he sees truth. So keep in mind that word gaze as we continue. We are in the years most likely 385 or 386. Just a reminder, the search for wisdom, which Augustine began when he was about 19, in the books we've been reading, they've largely been presented to us as an intellectual inquiry. We've been looking at all the intellectual parts, and that's why it can be toilsome to read this book. It's very intellectual. However, this type of inquiry comes to an end in book 7. But what we're going to see is even though he's getting some intellectual answers, he is still not satisfied. And of course, we're never satisfied till we have the heart and the mind joined together. Now, just to kind of look ahead, when we go up to book 8, this intellectual inquiry is going to move to a moral inquiry. And he will find resolution. So I hope as you're reading, you could feel this suspense that Augustine is building for us. And just a reminder, like with all the great books, going back to Plato, we are following Augustine on an ascent. In the Republic, to get out of the cave, it is an ascent. Think of Jacob and the ladder. It is an ascent, and that's how it is for all of us and all of great literature of the world. At this book here, where Augustine has started grasping onto some truth, but he's still struggling, we're exploring the tension here between redemption and resurrection, between conversion and the beatific vision. And this middle time is the time of paradox. I really I've mentioned before, the big set of books by scholar James O'Donnell. I'm going to use a lot of his language. He says in book 7, this self-diagnosed disease of Curiositas is brought to a crisis and it is cured. And for Augustine, a reminder, this curiositas is a lust of the eyes. And for Augustine, it's an amazing psychological discovery. That's why he's so fit for modern times. For Augustine, he realizes his appetite, his lust to know, provides this stimulus for this ongoing search for knowledge. And this search for knowledge, it's restless. We say our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Well, he's seeing his mind. It's never enough. How modern is this? We can understand this in our quest for knowledge and the times that we're living in. But it's a type of knowledge not leading to wisdom. It's a type of knowledge that leads to sin and to pride. And this is where Augustine, obviously with hindsight, he sees what he's doing, where he went wrong. He presents it masterfully to us as he's kind of talking over himself in the past and saying, you were looking for this, you found this, you did this, but I was too sick to really look at the truth, he tells us. During his struggle with seeing, he will keep asking a famous Augustinian question: what is evil anyway? He has asked this question in so many different ways throughout our reading. He knows truth exists, but what is evil? And if you keep reading, you'll I guess I could sum it up for you. He's going to see that evil is nothing. It is an absence of good. One of my professors, I remember, he said to think of evil as those. Do you ever go to Dunkin' Donuts? Those big donuts. There's a donut hole. That's evil. It's the absence of the good. So you'd have to have the big donuts, not the donut holes. But that's what he eventually does figure out. But let me try to sum it up I don't know if this helps or not, but this is, in this whole book, Augustine is having a philosophical breakthrough. He's learning to refute the materialism that was at the heart of his many objections to Christianity. He's struggling with the nature of God. You can see he's like, well, what do you look like? Where would you be? How would you fit here? He's not understanding the nature of God. He's not understanding the problem of evil. He also is questioning morality. Is there moral relativism or is there not? Obviously, the answer is no, but this is what he's struggling with. He sees that the objects of his imagination are limited to things that have matter and space, and yet God is not limited that way. Really, at the end of the day, we're dealing with the finite and the infinite. And Augustine is trying to place the infinite in the finite, and he cannot. And this is going to come up again in the marvelous book on time, where he's realizing, time only exists because eternity exists. He was thinking of it backwards. So he's having all this intellectual wrestling. It can be hard for us sometimes to follow. But I will say, Augustine's problem is the same problem I have and many of us do. It is a lack of imagination. And here's my commercial for a classical curriculum. As we know, this is a classical school. How I wish I would have had a classical education. I've learned the riches going backwards, but I know for certain I myself have had theological struggles simply because my imagination was formed in public school. It was formed in the way of the world. It was not formed in a classical environment where truth, beauty, and goodness was always presented to me. So he had a lack of imagination because of how he was raised. And so the sooner we catch it, the better. So it's a good time to also think about our own imagination, because I know it's been a struggle for me also. Now, one thing that helped Augustine in the struggle that he's facing, it is what we call the Platonicorum Libri. This is a Latin phrase that refers to Neoplatonic books. Augustine tells us he read some Neoplatonic books in Milan. They changed his life. And I'll just, make a side note that there's a lot of controversy and scandal and fights between scholars about these books, because it's an enigma, because people don't know, well, what books did he read? We don't know. He doesn't tell us. But he tells us a lot of what they did for him. We know from previous books that Augustine realized later that God carried him, even though he didn't know, subconsciously through Manichaeism and through coming out of Manichaeism, through skepticism, and that through all that, reading these Neoplatonic books gave him a new view. And I just wanted to remind you in book 7, this is not a chronological sequence. We've seen glimpses of this in previous books. Instead, this is presented as narrative convenience. That's how Augustine is doing it for us, because we've already talked about Plato, and I'll go back to that. In the middle of all this, there's this strange story with Firminius and the astrologers, and it's a confusing mess, and who died when and at this time and all that. But the long story, sometimes it can be hard to follow that story. What did Augustine learn from that story? He learned that the astrological vision of the world is flawed, and he says people learn things, quote, not by art, but by chance. Aha, that's a huge discovery for Augustine, because we know he's been struggling with this. And we've brought it up before. In the ancient world, the question of the stars is no small thing. Going back to Plato, people looked for answers in the stars. And of course, the Psalms speak of the stars. They're so important for us, but we don't look at them the way the pagans did. But the pagans knew enough, though, I will say, to look up. I would say many modern scholars lack that humility. That's why we love going back to the pagans, because they had the humility to say, I don't have the answers. I have to look up. And there's that beautiful humility that we see in a Plato, in an Aristotle, and even in Augustine's contemporaries who were wrong, but they were searching for the truth. So, he's struggling to find the truth. And if you read carefully, Augustine says he is afraid, quote, he says, death might overtake me before I found the truth. He says that quote there, he's afraid he's going to die before he finds the truth. Have you ever felt that way? I think Augustine is so easy to relate to. Now, I also think in his longing for a clear vision of God, I think this is helpful. And not everyone will agree with me because, scholars disagree. I think that Augustine both succeeds and fails. I remember learning from a great Catholic teacher once who said, every day we are winning the battle and we are losing the battle at the same time. And he said, that's what great literature teaches us. So I suppose if we looked at King Arthur or Chaucer or Shakespeare, we might see that. But I think it's helpful to step back and see where that's happening in our own lives. We may be winning the battle and losing the battle all at the same time. And I think we see this in chapter 7, because boy, Augustine sees certain things, but then he says, I see it, but I'm too sick to eat it. He says, I smell the food, but I can't eat, my stomach can't take it. I see the truth, but it's too bright, I can't look at it. So he is being healed, but there's still a lot of work to do. Also, very important here, did you notice Augustine using the issue of weight, actual weight, but he links it to morality. So weight in moral terms, because he is allowing lower things to preoccupy him. And so when lower things preoccupy us, what happens? When we let lower things preoccupy us, we are pulled down. So remember I told you this chapter is an ascent. But while we're climbing, we can look the wrong way, or our vision is clouded, and then we get pulled down. And Augustine he describes that in very dramatic terms. And he is thinking of a particular scripture when he talks about his vision. I'm going to show it to you here on the slide. This is from the 3rd chapter of Revelation. Look here. You will see ointment is needed. And I love this because, I love to read about the 7 churches in the book of Revelation, because that's all of us. We are part of those 7 churches. And, I think depending on what season you are in your life, the Lord is saying, we could be the church of Ephesus, or we could be the church of, Thyatira or something like that. But he's rebuking us. And I love this here. He's saying, you need ointment. You need to clear out that vision. And so I know that I've gotten that in prayer myself. So this is just a little example I'm giving you where everything Augustine says, he has a scripture in mind. It's all built on the edifice of scripture. Now, as we go into chapter 7 of book 7, why don't you open up to chapter 7 of book 7 and feel it? Because this is a big deal. This is a place where we have 6 books before us. And after this, one stands in the middle, and then we'll go to book 13. There's 13 books. But some people feel like Augustine laid this out in a particular numerical way, which I would not be surprised. And by the way, scholars say that because of his other works, in particular his works on Genesis. If you've ever read Augustine's other works, he's obsessed with numbers. There's a lot of numerology, the way he counts everything that happens in Genesis. Whoa. So some people think he is constructing his book that way. It's very geometrical. And a lot of the great books have a geometric structure. I'm thinking of Virgil's Aeneid. He wrote 11 lines a day, and it took 11 years. Oh my gosh, what about Dante? Everything in Dante is based on the number 3. And then it will go to 6 to 9. Everything is based for Dante is very geometrical. So is Augustine. And I just want to point out that part right here. In fact, for some scholars, looking at this chapter, some have even put, I think James O'Donnell does this in his commentary, nel mezzo del cammin. So if you love Dante, that's how he begins his great work. That's how he says, in the middle of the road, or in the middle of my life, or midway on my journey, however you want to translate it. But we're supposed to get the feeling here like, oh, we're in the middle. We're in the middle and a big moment. Now, in this book 7, Augustine has what we call an experience of ecstasy. An experience kind of outside of his body, which I'm going to get to in this book. Now, in chapter 7, Augustine writes beautifully about how his sufferings are so deep, there are no words. It reminds me again of the book of Job, where he has no words. And a lot of times, our most powerful prayer is sitting in front of Jesus with no words. And Augustine says his sufferings are mute. But he says, quote, Lord, your ears were open and I didn't even know it. And this is Augustine delighting in the fact that he was suffering so much and he probably felt so alone, but he's saying, God, you heard it, even though I couldn't get the words out. He says, my silent contritions were loud cries to your mercy. That's a line I took, by the way, from Hal Helms. He has a more modern translation of Augustine. I just like to have different ones in front of me for different seasons in life. Then he says, did the whole tumult of my soul, for which neither time nor words was sufficient, reach the ears of my closest friends? Yet it all went into your ears. All that I roared out from the groanings of my heart. Again, we know sometimes we have such deep suffering, we don't feel like any of our friends would understand. But he's saying God heard him. And then he has an intellectual event here where his thinking is reoriented. And he is reading those books about Plato, which we'll talk about. And he's starting to see things, but he does continue to say that Curiositas is still an obstacle. He says, my eyes were swelled shut by my pride. There's different ways to translate that sentence, but basically he had so much pride, he was blinded. And in this book, Augustine wants us to see that although he is prideful, there are enough parts of him, enough moments of humility that God has mercy on him. So this is an encounter really between Augustine's haughty intellect and the humbling grace of God. An encounter in which the books that he's reading become instruments. And I want to talk about these books as instruments. I want to go back to Plato because I said there's so much ink spilled about this for so long. Scholars have poured through this, and if you look carefully, although Augustine doesn't give us the name of the books, he doesn't even quote Plato. He doesn't even paraphrase the Neoplatonists, but he quotes scripture as though they were a summary of these Platonic books. I want to repeat that because this is big. While Augustine is describing to us the works of these Platonic authors, he is acting as if scripture is in those books. Now, he already employed this device. You might remember back in Book 3 when he's talking about the discovery of Cicero's Hortensius, which unfortunately no longer exists. But he's using this device again, but in a bigger way. And, we could ask, is this syncretism? What does Augustine mean when he says that the Platonic books had scripture inside of them? We could say, I think it'd be fair to say, this could invite a misreading And we should be careful here because I think there have been misreadings. It shouldn't be lost on us that Luther used a lot of Augustine during the Reformation. I think Augustine wrote so much, it can be easy to misunderstand him. And I think he can be misunderstood. Catholics can be misunderstood. For Augustine, these books, these Platonic books, were the culmination of a long search. But he did know it wasn't enough. So I want to emphasize that. But yet, he doesn't minimize the positive effect. So what we're saying here, and it's very Catholic, is that pagan works, if the pagan author is looking for the truth, can open us up to finding the real truth. And this is the deeply nuanced position of the Catholic Church. And it does get us in trouble sometimes. But it also built Western civilization. The great books, the great architecture, the great art, the scientific method. So many things we have in our civilization come from this tension. And we're seeing it up close here with Augustine. I want to mention a phrase that comes from Augustine that's famous. You may not know it comes from him. But in the 3rd chapter of Exodus, when the Israelites are leaving, they take the spoils of Egypt. Augustine wrote about that, and he said, us Christians, we take the spoils of Egypt. He says, I'm quoting here, whatever has been rightly said by the heathen, we must appropriate to our uses. So I'll paraphrase. He says in this whole discourse, anything beautiful in Egypt, when I say Egypt, I'm talking about any pagan civilization. Anything that's beautiful, we're going to take it and we're going to make it our own. We're going to baptize it. He'll admit there are some things in Egypt that can't be baptized. We don't want any part of it. But if it's beautiful, we'll take it because we know that Moses took the beauty of Egypt, used all that knowledge for the building of the tabernacle, and he used that beauty for God's greater glory. That's what Augustine's doing. And this is the foundation of Catholic education. We took what was best from Greece and Rome, and that's how we built our educational system. And it does scandalize some people. It upsets people. I just think if we could, and I'm speaking to myself, if we could all be better educated, informed about it, we would celebrate it more. But no one ever taught it to me. It's something we are rediscovering. Augustine says, you goaded me within to make me chafe impatiently until you should grow clear to my spiritual sight. At the unseen touch of your medicine, my swelling subsided, while under the stinging eye salve of curative pain, the fretful, darkened vision of my spirit began to improve day by day. To me, this sounds so much like Job. He's saying, your medicine, Lord, is painful. It is really hurting me, but it is curing me. So he's saying little by little, he started to see properly. So he's learning from the Platonists, but he is relying on God. It's a big difference, a big distinction there. Learning from Plato, relying on God. This is Augustine's journey. And in this book here, there's a moment of ecstasy. Now, we saw some moments like that before. Do you remember when we read about Alypius at the games, and Augustine suddenly saw how the soul wages war against the body? Just kind of this vision that he had. This happens here again in book 7. He has a moment of ecstasy where he sees beauty. And in fact, later on, I'm jumping ahead to chapter 17, he's going to talk about being ravished by God's beauty. It is erotic imagery. Augustine's not shy to use erotic imagery, but it left a memory in his soul, and it's so painful to him, he calls it a torment. And yet that pain was bliss because he never forgot it. So all through this chapter, he's hearing, he's seeing, he's smelling God, and it's not enough, and it's tormenting him. But he knows that he needs it, but he's just not well enough to fully grasp it. And it is a torment, and we could say probably akin to what the souls in purgatory experience. He says, I was drawn toward you by your beauty, but swiftly dragged away from you by my own weight. There's what I brought up earlier. Swept back headlong and groaning on to those things below myself. And this weight was carnal habit. Nevertheless, the memory of you stayed with me. And I think this is the journey of so many people, where God shows his goodness. We cling to it, but it's hard to say no to the world. This is a very typical journey, which is why this is such a masterpiece. And then he will, as he's thinking about the weight, as I mentioned, I'm in chapter 15. I know I went back and forth between 15 and 17. He will suddenly have the realization about time, that he says, Lord, things are only moving because you're still. It's a big realization for him. And of course, we all know that, right? But to really experience it beyond the intellect, into the heart, into 100% full knowledge, this was a big deal for him. Chapter 17, he literally says he's mounting to God, mounting. So he's climbing. It's like you could almost feel his sweat, right? This is a hard climb. This is in chapter 17. And I want to be clear too that I was reading from an author who said, don't get confused here. The fault is not the world, but the eye which contemplates it. I think that's really profound. So the fault isn't in the beautiful flowers of the field. It's how our eye beholds it. His inability to see. And later he will find, after his view is purified, he will find the way I'm seeing is the way the church sees reality. And it will be a great joy for him. There's also, as this book is closing, a period, some scholars call it a Christological confusion. He's confused about exactly who Christ is. He's not 100% on point about the Logos, the Word made flesh. He's still figuring it out. We see he has a lot of enthusiastic moments of discovery, but then he becomes greatly disillusioned because he hasn't reached his goal yet. So there's this anxious deliberation, and it will not be resolved until the garden in book 8. Hopefully that's not a spoiler, but if you've looked at the artwork that we have with our podcast, you already know everything's going to happen in the garden. And then it's really nice. He discovers St. Paul. Have you ever discovered St. Paul like an old friend, right? Sometimes I think we hear St. Paul, and then one day I think it's like, oh, wow, St. Paul. Isn't he he's something, isn't he? I think St. Paul is so rich, we can rediscover him over and over again. And I think it's exciting to read about how Augustine, he's just like, geez, St. Paul. And again, scholars really wonder about this. They're like, well, what is he reading of St. Paul? Did he already read Galatians? Is he reading Romans? So they're trying to pick all that apart. I think it's really fun. He recalls here that he read Paul, and also that he spoke to Simplicianus the importance of friends. We need friends who are going to lead us into truth. And also, Paul, think about it. He is the Christian writer about revelation. I'm sure Augustine is thinking of 2 Corinthians 12, where Augustine has his description of this revelation that he had 14 years ago. He says, and I think Augustine has given us this nudge, like, I had a St. Paul moment too. And we're going to see more St. Paul moments. And I think it's encouraging because I believe if we take the time to look, we all have St. Paul moments, and we all see when I say see visions, I don't mean a saint or an angel or God himself have to literally appear to us, but we see God all over us and in all of creation if we have eyes to see. And that's why I think the Lord is so hard on the Pharisees when he says, you're blind, you don't want to see. So this vision here is really important. And if you read Augustine's language, when he has these moments, like I said, he talks about a gaze. This is another word for contemplation. You know, last year we spent a year with St. Teresa in her interior castle. We talked a lot about contemplation. Augustine is using the word gaze. And I believe St. Therese, the little flower, another doctor of the church, doesn't she say that too? I think it's in the catechism. She says prayer is, he looks at me and I look at him. It's that simple. So Augustine's giving us his, maybe even his masculine way of doing this. Of course, in prayer, we move beyond the masculine and the feminine, but still we're flesh. And I think as women, some things are going to speak a certain way to us, and as men, it'll be a little different. So this emphasis on Paul's hearing is getting us ready for Book 8. So here I'm talking to you about seeing, right? In Book 8, it's about listening. And I think Augustine is giving us a foretaste to remind us how important hearing is. Now, if you notice, you could go back. If you look at the end of Book 6, and then you look at our book, the end of Book 7, did you notice they both end on a note of fear? However, in each case, this is James O'Donnell, he says, the difference may be measured. And I love that because when we go through our own weaknesses and fears, I'm like, Lord, just let it be a little bit better. And I think, we just want to see some progress sometimes. And I like that there is progress here because in Book 6 and even at the beginning of Book 7, there's like this fear of death, this look at the abyss, this void, this fear, like, am I ever going to find it? And when Book 6 ends, if you go back and look, there's not like a clear path forward, which unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, is part of our journey too. Sometimes the Lord does not show us a path forward. He just says, hold tight to my hand and my light will show you the next little tiny step, and then sometimes he shows you more, but it can be scary, right? So at the end of Book 6, there's no clear path forward, but Augustine knew how to hold on in faith. But at the end of Book 7, now the path is there. But what's lacking? Courage. And this is, we all can relate to this. Like, then there are times where the Lord's like, you know what? I'm showing you how to go. Go. Walk on that water. And we don't want to. It's scary. So here, Augustine needs the courage to step out. And I think that would be a beautiful thing to reflect upon as we close Book 7. Where are the areas where there's no path forward and we just need to hold on tight? Where are the areas where the Lord is showing us a path, but we just don't want to? So I could certainly relate to all of that. But here, we could call it renewed uncertainty at the presence of a fork in the road. And so I'm just going to close with how he closes the book. And while I do, we'll put up some slides here. He is drawing from 1 Corinthians 15 and Habakkuk chapter 3. So as we read the end, these two scriptures are the foundation, just really trying to show you how everything Augustine says is scriptural. He says, in awe-inspiring ways, these truths were striking deep roots within me. As I read the least of your apostles, that's Paul, I had contemplated your works and was filled with dread. Different translations have different ways of ending that, but again, he does know the path forward, and good news, he's going to get on that path in Book 8, and we will see you there next time.